The sound was the first thing they noticed. A rhythmic scrape and thud, day after day, coming from the widow Maeve's property at the edge of the settlement. It was not the clean chop of an axe splitting firewood, nor the ring of a hammer on stubborn steel. It was a dull, heavy sound. The sound of earth being moved. Men riding past on their way to the river would rein in their horses, listening. Women walking the dusty track to visit a neighbor would pause, shading their eyes to look at the small cabin sitting stark against the wide, unforgiving sky. There she would be, a solitary figure in a plain dress, her face smudged with soil, her arms slick with sweat. She was digging. Not a well, not a root cellar beside the house. She had torn up the floorboards inside her own cabin, and with a shovel and a bucket, was excavating the ground beneath her feet. The growing pile of dirt beside her door was a testament to her unending labor, a small mountain of dark earth that seemed to mock the tidy, sun-baked yards of everyone else. Abram, the settlement's self-appointed patriarch, stopped one afternoon, his hands on his hips. "What in God's name are you doing to your own home, woman?" Maeve didn't stop digging. She just drove the shovel into the compacted earth, leveraged it with her whole body, and tossed another load onto the bucket. "Improving it," she said, her voice tight with effort. Her answer was too short, too final. It invited no further questions, yet it created 1,000. Abram scoffed, a dry, rattling sound. "Improving it? You're turning it into a pit." A badger would be proud of that hole. He turned to the two men with him, who chuckled dutifully. The name was born in that moment of casual cruelty. They started calling it the widow's dirt hole. It became a joke, a piece of local lore told over lukewarm beer at the saloon. They said she'd lost her mind after her husband passed, that she was trying to dig her way to China, or perhaps just digging a grave big enough for her sorrow. Maeve heard the whispers. She felt the stares when she walked into the general store for salt and flour. Her shoulders, already strong from the work, seemed to straighten even more, her chin held a fraction higher. She did not explain. She did not defend. She simply bought her goods, paid with the last of her husband's carefully saved coins, and walked back to the sound of her own solitary work, to the growing darkness beneath her floor. The hole grew deeper. It was no longer a pit, it was a chamber. She worked by the unsteady light of a single lantern, the air thick with the smell of damp soil and her own sweat. The work was brutal, a relentless cycle of digging, hoisting, and dumping. Her hands were raw, the calluses tearing open only to be replaced by thicker, tougher skin. Her back ached with a fire that never fully went out. But with every bucket of earth she removed, a quiet, fierce satisfaction settled in her heart. She was building something no one could see, a secret architecture born of foresight and desperation. She shored up the earthen walls with thick planks of wood salvaged from a collapsed barn miles away, a task that had taken her a week of hauling, piece by piece. She built a sturdy ladder to descend into the deep rectangular space she had carved from the earth. Above, the sun beat down on the parched land. The days were hot and dry, the nights growing cooler with a sharp, brittle edge that hinted at the change of seasons. The other settlers tended their gardens, their neat rows of beans and squash and, most prized of all, their tomatoes. They staked them high, their leaves a vibrant green, their fruit slowly blushing from yellow to a promising red. They were symbols of a good harvest, of security against the coming winter. Maeve had no such garden. Her yard was barren save for the great pile of excavated dirt. "She'll be begging for scraps come first frost," Abram declared to anyone who would listen. All that work for nothing but a hole in the ground, but Maeve was not idle. In the cool, stable darkness of her earthen room, she began to build boxes. Long, deep troughs filled with a careful mixture of the rich subsoil she had excavated and the manure she had painstakingly collected and composted over the year. She worked with a quiet intensity, her movements efficient and practiced. Then came the seeds. From a small, cloth-wrapped bundle, she took out the tomato seeds her mother had given her years ago, seeds carried across half a continent. She planted them with a reverence that was almost prayerful, pressing each one into the dark, waiting soil. The first green shoots were a private miracle. They pushed through the soil in the lantern light, pale and determined. Down in the cool, silent earth, far from the mocking eyes of the settlement, life was beginning. Maeve tended to them with a fierce, maternal devotion. She devised a system for watering, a careful rationing of the water she hauled from the creek each morning. The air in the underground chamber was different, still and humid, insulated from the drastic temperature swings of the world above. The earth itself seemed to breathe warmth into the space, a slow, steady heat that the plants craved. She spent more time below ground than above it. The cabin's main room was now just a shell, a lid covering her true home. The floorboards were laid back in place, but loosely, with a large section that lifted like a trapdoor. During the day, she would prop it open, letting a shaft of dusty sunlight pierce the gloom. But it wasn't enough. The plants needed more. It was then that the second phase of her strange construction began. On the south-facing side of her cabin's roof, she carefully removed a section of shingles. In their place, she installed a series of glass panes she had traded her husband's good coat for months ago, creating a crude but effective skylight. The glass was old and warped, but it caught the high summer sun and funneled a pale, greenish light down into the darkness. It was a strange sight, a patch of glittering glass on an otherwise unremarkable cabin. It only fueled the town's speculation. "Now she's putting in windows to look at the sky," one man laughed. "What's she going to see from the bottom of her dirt hole?" But the light, weak as it was, worked. The tomato plants, which had been spindly and pale, began to darken to a healthy green. They grew with a shocking vitality, their vines thick and strong, climbing the trellises she had built for them. Small yellow flowers appeared, then gave way to the hard, green nubs of infant tomatoes. Maeve felt a thrill every time she descended the ladder. It was a hidden world of her own making, a secret garden thriving on ingenuity. Above ground, the talk continued, but it was starting to be tinged with a grudging curiosity. The sheer persistence of her labor was hard to ignore. The mountain of dirt was no longer growing, but she was still down there, day in and day out. What was she doing in the dark? The air began to change. The relentless heat of summer broke, and the nights grew colder. A new sharpness was in the wind that swept across the plains, a whisper of the hardship to come. The settlers watched the sky, their faces etched with the familiar anxiety of the season. They harvested their squash and beans, their hands moving with a practiced urgency. Their tomato vines were heavy with fruit, much of it still green. They needed a few more weeks of sun, a few more weeks of warmth to bring the crop to its full, red ripeness. Maeve felt the cold, too. But when she descended into her subterranean garden, the air was still and cool, not cold. The massive thermal battery of the surrounding earth kept the temperature stable. Her plants were flourishing. The fruits were swelling, their skins turning from green to shades of orange and a deep, promising crimson. She moved among them, her lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the earthen walls. The smell of the vines was rich and loamy, a scent of life in a world that was preparing for dormancy. One evening, a woman named Clara, who lived on the next claim over, stopped by. Her face was pinched with worry. "The almanac says a frost is coming early this year, Maeve," she said, her voice low. "A hard one. My Henry says we'll lose half the tomatoes." Maeve looked at Clara's chapped hands and the fear in her eyes. She offered no easy comfort. "The almanac is often right," was all she said. Clara lingered, her eyes drifting to the loose floorboards of the cabin. They say you've been digging." "What for?" For the first time, Maeve offered a piece of the truth. "For the warmth," she said simply. "The ground holds the summer's heat longer than the air does." Clara stared at her, a flicker of understanding in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. It made no sense. A hole was a cold place. A grave was a cold place. She shook her head and left, more unsettled than when she had arrived. The rumor of Maeve's strange answer spread through the settlement, but it did little to quell the mockery. "The warmth!" Abram bellowed, slapping his knee. "She's dug herself a tunnel to hell, has she?" The laughter was loud, but it had a brittle edge now. The cold was coming, and everyone knew it. The frost arrived not as a gentle dusting of white, but as a silent, killing blanket. It settled over the land in the deep, moonless hours of the night. In the morning, the world was rimmed with silver. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. A collective groan of despair rose from the settlement as people walked out to their gardens. The broad leaves of the squash plants were blackened and limp. The beanstalks, once so sturdy, were wilted and dead. But the greatest tragedy was the tomatoes. The vines were scorched black, as if by fire. The fruits, from the smallest green ones to those that had been on the cusp of ripeness, were ruined. They hung on the dead vines, their skins already turning soft and watery. They would be rotten in a day. The work of a season, the hope for winter preserves, was gone in a single night. A somber mood fell over the community. There would be no canned tomatoes, no savory sauces to enrich the lean winter meals. It was a devastating loss, one that would be felt in the gnawing emptiness of their bellies in the months to come. That afternoon, Abram's wife, Martha, walked the track to Maeve's cabin. She moved slowly, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She did not come to mock. She came because of a desperate, illogical flicker of curiosity. She found Maeve outside, calmly stacking firewood. There was no sign of distress on her face, no hint of the agricultural catastrophe that had befallen everyone else. "Your garden," Martha began, her voice trailing off. "Did you lose everything too?" Maeve looked at her, her expression unreadable. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Come inside," she said. Martha hesitated, then followed her into the sparse, floor-boarded room. It was dim and smelled of earth. Maeve walked to the center of the room, bent down, and lifted the heavy trap-door. She picked up the lantern from the floor. "Follow me." Martha peered into the darkness, her heart pounding. The ladder descended into blackness. She could smell it now, not rot, not death, but the rich, living scent of green plants. Hesitantly, she followed Maeve down the rungs. When her feet touched the packed earth floor and Maeve raised the lantern, Martha gasped. Before her was a vision of impossible summer. Rows of tomato plants, lush and green, stood in the warm, still air. They were heavy with fruit, clusters of perfectly ripe, crimson globes hanging from the vines. The sight was so unbelievable, so contrary to the frozen devastation above, that for a moment Martha thought she was dreaming. "How?" she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The earth," Maeve said, running a hand gently over a smooth, red fruit. "It holds the warmth." The news spread through the settlement like a grass fire. Martha's story was met first with disbelief, then with a desperate, hungry curiosity. Abram was the first to arrive, his face a mask of stern denial. He marched into Maeve's cabin without knocking and demanded to see for himself. Maeve, without a word, lifted the door and pointed to the ladder. He descended, his heavy boots thudding on the rungs. The silence that followed was profound. When he emerged minutes later, his face was pale. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. "Sweet Mother of God," he muttered to the small crowd that had gathered outside. It's true they came in a slow, steady procession after that. Men, women, their faces tight with worry and want. Maeve let them see. She let them descend one by one into her hidden sanctuary and witness the miracle she had built with her own 2 hands. The mockery was gone, replaced by a stunned silence. The name they had given her project, the widow's dirt hole, was no longer an insult. It was a name spoken with a new, strange reverence. But seeing was one thing, tasting was another. The need in the settlement was real and immediate. The first to ask was Clara. She came with a small sack of flour, her eyes downcast. "Maeve," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know it's a lot to ask. But my family, we have nothing put away for the winter. Could I trade you this flour for just a few?" Maeve looked at the meager offering, then at the woman's desperate face. This was the moment she had prepared for, the turning point she had known would come. Her first instinct was to guard her creation, to protect the resource that guaranteed her own survival. But she also saw the genuine need, the fear that mirrored her own past grief. She nodded slowly. "1 basket," she said. For the flower, the relief on Clara's face was so profound it was painful to watch. Maeve descended into her garden and returned with a small basket brimming with red, fragrant tomatoes. The sight of them, the smell of them, brought tears to Clara's eyes. The exchange set a precedent. Soon, others came, bearing what little they could spare, a few jars of honey, a bolt of cloth, a promise of mending work, a share of the venison from a successful hunt. Maeve became the center of a new, fragile economy. She was no longer the crazy widow on the edge of town. She was the woman who held summer captive in the earth. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, the pressure on Maeve intensified. Her supply of tomatoes, though miraculous, was not infinite. The plants continued to produce in the stable warmth of the pit, but it was a slow, steady ripening, not a boundless harvest. The initial gratitude of the townsfolk began to curdle into a more demanding desperation. They saw her as a solution, a bottomless well of sustenance, and their need made them blind to the limits of her creation. Abram, having recovered from his initial shock, now saw her success as a resource for the entire community, a resource he felt entitled to manage. He approached her one evening, flanked by 2 other men from the town council. "Maeve," he began, his tone reasonable but firm. "What you've done is remarkable. A true blessing. But the town is facing a hard winter. We need to organize this. We need to ensure a fair distribution." Maeve stood in her doorway, a physical barrier between them and her home. The lantern light from within cast a warm glow on her face, but her eyes were cool. "I am being fair," she replied. "Those who trade, receive trade." Abram scoffed. "People are hungry. This isn't the time for trade. This is a time for sharing. We are a community. I built this community with my own hands, Abram," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "While this community was laughing. I dug it, I timbered it, I planted it. This harvest is mine." The confrontation was a stark line drawn in the dirt. The men left, their faces dark with resentment. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't laced with mockery. They were laced with something far more dangerous, envy. They started to see her not as a savior, but as a hoarder. "She's sitting on a mountain of food while our children go hungry," one man grumbled at the saloon. "It ain't right." The sense of being watched grew. Maeve felt eyes on her cabin at all hours. She began barring her door at night, a practice she had long abandoned. The sound of footsteps outside after dark would make her freeze, her hand reaching for the heavy iron poker by the hearth. The threat was no longer the impersonal cruelty of the weather, it was the focused, hungry desperation of her neighbors. Her sanctuary, her secret garden, had become a prison and a target. The breaking point came on a bitter night when the wind howled and rattled the very bones of her cabin. She was awakened by a sound from above, not outside. A scraping, splintering noise coming from her roof. Her heart seized. They weren't trying the door. They were trying to get in through the glass, through the fragile skylight that fed her plants the light they needed to live. She grabbed the lantern and the heavy poker, her hand shaking but her resolve hardening into a cold, sharp point. She scrambled up the ladder from her garden, her bare feet finding the rungs in the dark. As she emerged into the cabin, she saw it, the silhouette of a man against the moonlit glass panes. He had a crowbar and was prying at the frame. Rage, cold and pure, surged through her. This was an invasion not just of her home, but of her labor, her ingenuity, her very survival. "Get down from there," she yelled, her voice raw. The figure froze, then smashed the crowbar down. A pane of glass shattered, sending a shower of glittering shards down onto the floor, some tumbling into the darkness of the pit below. The cold night air rushed in, a violation of the carefully maintained warmth. In that moment, Maeve did not think. She acted. She ran outside into the biting wind, grabbing a heavy piece of firewood from the stack. The man was still on the roof, trying to widen the hole. She recognized him. It was a farmer named Thomas, a man with a quiet wife and a perpetually worried face. A man who had traded her a worn-out shovel head for a handful of tomatoes just a week ago. "Thomas, get down," she screamed over the wind. He looked down, his face a pale oval of desperation in the moonlight. I have to, Maeve. My family, they're sick. They need the food. This is not the way, she cried. You'll kill the plants. You'll destroy everything. But he was beyond reason, his fear a wild animal that had taken control. He raised the crowbar again. Maeve didn't hesitate. She hurled the piece of firewood with all the strength in her arms. It spun through the air and struck the roof near his feet with a loud crack. He flinched, lost his footing on the slick shingles, and slid, tumbling off the edge and landing with a heavy, sickening thud on the frozen ground. He lay there, groaning, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The crisis was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Maeve stood over him, the wind whipping her hair around her face. The poker was still clutched in her hand. Thomas lay on the ground, whimpering, his desperation now just plain pain. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. This was what it had come to. Her success had turned her neighbor into an enemy, and her into a guard. She lowered the poker. She went inside, found a blanket, and covered him. Then she went back down the ladder into her garden. The cold air was already pouring through the broken skylight, a death sentence for the delicate plants. Shards of glass littered the soil around one of the troughs. She worked quickly, methodically, patching the hole in the roof with spare planks and oilcloth, a temporary fix against the killing cold. The warmth of the earth would fight the cold, but the balance was now fragile. When she was done, she returned to Thomas. She splinted his broken leg as best she could and, with immense effort, helped him back to his own cabin, leaving him with his frightened wife and a basket of tomatoes. She said nothing of the break-in. The act of mercy was harder than the act of defense. The next morning, the entire settlement knew what had happened. Thomas, humbled and shamed, had confessed everything. A Samba delegation, led by Abram, arrived at her door. They did not come with demands this time. They came with hats in their hands and shame on their faces. Maeve, Abram said, his voice raspy. We were wrong. We let our fear make us ugly. What Thomas did was unforgivable. What you did after, well. We have no right to ask anything of you. Maeve looked at their faces, at the genuine remorse etched there. She saw not a mob, but a collection of scared, hungry people who had lost their way. Her anger was gone, burned out. The glass is broken, she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. The cold got in. I don't know how many of the plants will survive. A silence fell. They understood. Their desperate act had nearly destroyed the very thing they wanted to save. It was Clara who spoke first. I have some glass, she said quietly. From my mother's old picture frames. It's not much, but it might help. Another man stepped forward. I'm a fair carpenter. I can fix the frame proper. A third offered nails. A fourth, his labor. That day, they worked. It was not a trade, it was a reparation. The men, under Maeve's quiet direction, repaired the skylight, fitting the mismatched pieces of glass into a new, stronger frame. The women helped clear the broken shards from her garden, their hands moving with a new, careful respect among the precious vines. They worked together, a silent apology written in the language of labor. They were not just repairing a roof, they were mending the torn fabric of their community. In the weeks that followed, a new system emerged. It was not Maeve's system of trade, nor Abram's system of forced sharing. It was something in between. A communal fund of goods and labor was established. Families contributed what they could, firewood, flour, game, mending, and in return, received a small, carefully rationed share of the tomatoes. Maeve was no longer a lone operator. She was a steward. She taught them the principles of her garden, the importance of the earth's insulation, the way the light must be angled, the delicate balance of moisture and warmth. She was not just giving them food, she was giving them knowledge. The winter was long and hard, as predicted. But it was not as bleak as it might have been. The bright, acidic taste of a tomato in the dead of January was more than just sustenance. It was a taste of summer, a symbol of hope, a reminder of the stubborn ingenuity that had saved them. When spring finally came, melting the snow and softening the hard ground, the settlement looked different. Next to several cabins, new excavations had begun. The settlers were not just planting gardens in the sun. They were digging. They were creating their own small pockets of warmth, their own defenses against the killing frost. They no longer called it the widow's dirt hole. They called it a winter garden. And Maeve, no longer just the widow on the edge of town, would walk from site to site, her hand smudged with dirt, sharing the hard-won wisdom that had grown in the dark, silent earth beneath her floor.